eyes, by seeing and all that. That's what we call perception. Now, beyond the 6 senses that we know we have, we also have some other senses. These senses are called extrasensory senses, or they go into what we call the ESP. Scientifically, we refer to that as what we call the extrasensory perception. Now, the first perception that I've just talked about is the perception of the senses, or the 5 senses. But we go to what we call other senses. We have what we call other senses. And these senses are what we refer to as the extrasensory perception. Now, what are the other forms of perceptions? We call them extrasensory. Why? Because they are beyond the senses, but we also perceive. Like I've said, perception refers to picking information from the mind, or picking some information rather from the environment. So beyond the seeing, beyond the touching, beyond the tasting, beyond the hearing, human beings also have the capacity to pick up information using what we call the extrasensory perception. And what do we mean by this? The extrasensory perception I'm talking about, this is what we call clairvoyancy. We use what we call clairvoyancy. It's one of the forms of extrasensory perception. We have what we call telekinesis or telepathy, and then we have what we call clairvoyancy. We have what we call precognition, and then you have what we call retrocognition. Let me break down a little bit simpler so that we can understand what I'm trying to put forward here. Now, telepathy is you are here thinking about someone, and then that someone is also thinking about you at the same time, right? You think of calling someone, and then this person calls you in that right time. That is what we call telepathy, or that's what we call telepathy. It's also a form of perception. Now, it appears to be a little bit instinctual. It appears to be out of instincts. It appears to be a little bit out beyond our sensory perception. And so much people talk about it in what we call the conscious and subconscious minds part of that, but I'll get back to that. But I've just said we have what called clairvoyancy, telekinesis or telepathy, and then precognition and retrocognition. Those are also forms of perception that I will come back to maybe in the next program. We shall be in a position to break them down for you so that you may grasp the abstract. Now, we've just talked about perception, and I've just said perception refers picking information from the environment. What about conception? Now, when the information comes from the public, from the environment, for instance, when I look at something, the light rays get into my eyes and information is interpreted, the image is formed on the retina, like remember that primary science, now you have perceived. Now, what is cognition? Conception. Conception is the role of the brain. Conception is making interpretation of what you've been in position to perceive. Any kind of information that you've been in position to put in, that is perception. Now, conception is how do you make sense out of what you've been in position to perceive. Now, that is what we call conception. Now, from perception, we go to conception. Now, it is the brain that conceives, and it's the brain that perceives. The senses perceive, the brain conceives. In other words, it makes interpretation. Now, the interpretation of the information, of the message, of the data that has been perceived or that has been conceived, that has been perceived by the senses, the conception, the breaking down, the interpretation, the making sense of whatever a human being has perceived is what we call the role of the mind. In other words, what we call the mind is whatever the brain does. Now, the brain is the biological organ that you've been in position to look at, which has neurons and all that. Now, making sense of the data, of the information that have been in position to pick up from the environment is what we call conception. Now, the conception is what we call the mind, right? I don't know if I'm making sense. So we talked about perception, getting information from the environment. Conception is making sense out of what I've perceived. Now, whenever we talk about conception, now that is what we call the mind. Now, what is the mind in that very angle? Mind refers to the work of the brain. Whatever the brain does is what we call the mind. Now, the brain is the biological organ. That is what is made up in the human brain. The brain is the biological organ. But the work of the brain is what we call the mind. Now, the mind is divided into two. Whatever the brain does is what we call the mind. The mind is divided into two. We have what we call the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. I would ask our producer to give us that image of Freud, of Sigmund Freud, that has the conscious and the subconscious mind, such that we can make it a little bit simpler. Now, right now, thank you so much. Now, right now, I'm looking at right to you. I'm looking into the camera. I am conscious. Now, whatever a human being can be in position to be, to perceive, to make sense out of whatever they're seeing using their gifted senses. In other words, whatever you can see, whatever you can touch, whatever you can smell, whatever you can see, whatever you can taste using your tongue is what we call a conscious process. Now, the consciousness in human beings, it's not even 10%. In other words, right now I'm looking into this camera and I'm speaking right to you, right? That's what we call the conscious process. I'm looking at you right now. I'm looking to the camera. I'm aware that I'm speaking out. I'm speaking about the mindset. But that doesn't mean that the food that I ate at lunchtime is not being broken down. That doesn't mean that the blood inside me is not moving up and down. That doesn't mean that I'm not breathing in. But my focus is at speaking. I am focusing at speaking right so that I can be in a position to deliver this message. Now, that's what we call the conscious part of your mind. Now, surprisingly, what we are conscious about as human beings is very, very limited in our experiences. Why? Because the brain cannot take in a lot of information. So the point is the conscious and the subconscious mind. So the conscious bit of it is what thinking is all about. I am speaking right now to you because I really want to make sense. I really want to have the best definition and clarity such that you may understand what I'm trying to say. And you're looking at your screen because you want to understand exactly what I'm trying to mean as a speaker, as someone who's speaking out. That means you are conscious. In other words, what we pay attention to is what we refer to as the conscious mind. Don't forget, I said that the conscious is what we are aware of. I said that I'm talking about the term mindset. But before we define the mindset, let's first understand what we call the mind. Now, the work that I'm referring to, if you're an academia or if you're a person who is interested in reading, you can look for work, for research that was done by a gentleman called Sigmund Freud. Now, what I am paying attention to, what you are paying attention to apparently is what we call the conscious mind. And in our life experiences, we don't have powers to pay attention more than to pay. Okay, we're not in position to understand exactly what we can pay attention to more than 5%. Now, that's very ridiculous. In other words, right now you might be taking something, you might be eating something, you might be taking, sipping or quenching or having a club or having, any drink that you're taking in. What you pay attention to is what we call the conscious part of the mind. What about what you're not paying attention to? Okay, when you put food into your mouth, the mouth is conscious because the tongue can be in a position to have the taste buds and get to know that you're eating food, right? But after chewing, this food, there is a continuous process that doesn't stop. When you eat food and then it gets out of your mouth, that's where we stop. We think that everything has stopped. No, I want to let you know that everything is just getting started. For us, after chewing and breaking down the food goes into our gut and goes into our system. Now, what we are conscious of remains there. It stops there. Now, whatever happens inside of us is what you can refer to as the subconscious bit of it. So what is the subconscious bit of it? The subconscious part of our mind is almost 95%. Is almost 95%. This is going to be a little bit very amazing. I ask that you move up with me so that you can be in position to understand exactly what I'm trying to say. In other words, most of the things that happen to us in our lives, we are not in the know. We are not aware. Life is happening, but we don't pay attention. We are not even aware because we are hidden. Now, just like you've seen the image that I put on the screen, that is what we call an iceberg. Now, an iceberg is always big, is always small at the top. When you look at the iceberg, whatever you see is always big on the top. It's always small on the top. The biggest part of the iceberg and the biggest part of the iceberg is always underneath the waters. So what you can be in position to see, what you can be in position to experience, what you can be in position to have as a human being is always limited. What you can't see is always the biggest. I don't know if our producer can be in position to give us the first bit of the Titanic. Now, we are going to use a bit of Hollywood movies to make sure that we understand this. Now, we are all very aware, some of us may not be aware, but there is a very big movie. I want us to go back and watch this movie, but in a very different way, right? Now, the movie is called Titanic. Movie Titanic is by Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. I request my producer to play it so that I can come back. Now, No, let me first explain a bit, and then you can have it still. Now, in this movie, Titanic, this ship, or this Titanic means something that's very big. It was sailing from Liverpool, the United Kingdom.